For this demonstration, I've created a brand new website, and I'm just going to add some content to the default page. So first of all, we need to go view the Server Explorer, which is here. And I'll pin this down for our purposes now. And you should have, within your Server Explorer, a data connection for the Northwind sample database. If you don't, for whatever reason, you can right-click on Data Connections, choose Add Connection. Here, choose the server name, which should be /SQL Express. Once you've done that, down here, choose from the list of databases the Northwind sample database. And of course, this requires you to have installed the Northwind sample database as described in the introduction for this course. I won't do this because I already have that connection configured. Here, I have my connection. I'll open it up and expand Tables. And from the list of tables, I'm going to do something crazy. I'm just going to take a table, Customers, and drag it onto my page to see what happens. You can see what happens is Visual Studio creates for me a grid view control with all of the fields bound to a SQL data source control. Well, I really don't want all of the fields, so I'm going to start over again. Let's start here and delete this, and let's pick a subset of the fields. To do that, I'll click on Customer ID, and then Control-click on Company Name, Contact Name, and Country. Those are the only fields I need for this demonstration. Now, let's drag those onto the design surface. As you might expect, now this creates a grid view control with just those fields showing. Well, where did those fields come from? They came from this data source. If we examine this data source, you'll see that it contains just those 4 fields, as you might expect. Of course, when I dragged those fields on, all Visual Studio did for me was create the SQL data source and the grid view control. There was nothing there I couldn't have done myself. That is, by dragging a SQL data source control on, configuring it, setting up the fields I want by creating a SQL string, and then adding a grid view control to the page and setting its data source to be that SQL data source. Now the grid view control has this smart tag. We click it and we get grid view tasks displayed. I'll choose Auto Format first and choose Classic formatting. We've now auto-formatted the grid. One thing to note is that when you set formatting for the grid, you're just suggesting styles. If we look down here, for example, there is, the header style. The header style has a background color. Right now it's set to this magic number, which I'll copy to the clipboard so I can put it back. But I can choose any other color I want, and then it modifies the header style. So don't take these auto formats as gospel. You can always change any of the styles here in the Properties window, including the row style, the selected row style, and so on, just by modifying the properties in the Properties window. Back in the Grid View Tasks pane, I'll enable paging, sorting, editing, and selection. There's a reason I'm not allowing deleting, and it should be pretty clear because we can't delete a row. Because of the referential integrity rules, attempting to delete a row will cause a failure. All right, well, let's just save it and view it. So far, we've written no code at all. I'll right-click, View in Browser. We have a grid. Our grid now displays information from the Northwind sample database. We can page through the data. Again, we're looking at the second or third or fourth page. We can sort by any one of these columns by first clicking on the column name and then clicking again to sort in the opposite order. Sort by country, sort by company name, and so on. We can select a row, and all that does is force the page to do a round trip to the server and redraw the grid using a different style for the selected row. We can edit a row. If I click Edit, change that name, click Update, and it took the setting that I changed and stored it in the database. Now remember, It's important to understand that when I dragged those items onto the page, I'm effectively creating a two-tier application. The SQL data source does that. If you want to look into building an n-tier application, you need to review the object data source or the link data source, both of which provide for an n-tier scenario. Since I'm looking at the grid view control here and not the data source, I'm going to keep it simple and use the SQL data source control. If we look at the source for this page, we'll find that the SQL data source includes all of its necessary parameters to do the work it needs to do, and the grid view control, well, all we've done is set up various settings that control the behavior of the grid view control in the markup. So when you make changes in the designer, all you're doing is affecting the markup of the page. There's no magic here, nothing hidden from you. The beauty of ASP.NET is its transparency. Everything you do in the designer reflects in something you find in the markup. You'll find here bound field elements that define a data field that tell us what it's bound to and other information about that bound field. It's these bound field elements that cause this grid to have binding to its data source. We'll also find for the grid itself, up here, we should have a data source ID property, which tells us which data source provides the data for this grid. Currently, the grid shows these 4 columns of data from all rows in the data source. What if we want to filter the grid to only show rows from a specific country? We can use the data source control to do the work to filter the grid. Well, let's continue this demonstration and try it out. To do this, I'm going to need to add a second SQL data source. Let me go to the toolbox, go down to the Data tab, get a SQL data source control, and drag it on. This one is going to fill the data in a drop-down list with a list of countries. This is a good way to review working with the SQL data source control as well. We'll configure the data source. I'm going to choose my existing connection string. I can even verify the contents of that connection string. Let's go to the next page. I want here a unique list of countries. To do that, I'll choose customers. I only really want a list of countries, and I only want unique rows. That adds the distinct keyword here. I don't need to order this list because when I ask for a distinct list, it automatically sorts the data. I'll go to the next page. Let's test the query, and that gives me a list of individual countries from which all my customers come. Let's finish this configuration. So SQL Data Source 2 contains the data, or will contain the data, for our drop-down list. Up here, I need room for my drop-down list, so I'll hit Enter to add some blank space. I'll come up here, get a drop-down list, drag it on, and let's now choose the data source. I want to choose SQL Data Source 2, and as I may have mentioned before, in previous versions of Visual Studio before 2005, Microsoft was really loath to pre-fill in any properties. They wouldn't guess. Well, they've figured that they need to guess here because if they hadn't guessed, they would have gotten it completely wrong. Here they got it completely right. There's only one field in that data source. I now have country as the data field and country as the field to display. So, I'm done. Oh, wait. I need to enable auto postback so when I choose a country from the list, it automatically filters the grid. Let's save it and try it. I'll view the page in a browser. There's our list of countries, and I choose one and it filters the grid. Oh wait, this is one of those do what I mean, not what I say situations. I never told the grid to filter itself. So we need to take a little bit of extra work to cause the grid to reduce its rows based on the selected country. Well, would I do that in the grid or where? Well, remember, it's not the grid that's retrieving the data. The grid's just taking the data given to it and displaying it. That happens that is, the filtering needs to happen in SQL Data Source 1. So let's go Configure SQL Data Source 1. I'll go to the next page. Here we are. I need to add a where clause. The where clause says, let me only show rows where the country equals the value coming from one of these things. We could choose a control. That's what we're going to use. A cookie value, a form value, a profile value, a query string item that is coming on the query string in the URL, or a session variable. Well, I want a control. I want the value from drop-down list 1. I don't need a default value because the drop-down list always has a value. And I'll add this. This tells me that I've added the where clause where country equals @country, and I'll supply the value of @country using drop-down list 1.selectedValue, that property. Click OK. You can see the modification, the where clause in my SQL string. Click Next. I like to test these things. When I click Test, I'm offered the option to enter a country, perhaps France. And here I see all the customers that come from France and no other country. I'll click Finish. And now that should be all it takes to make this demonstration work. Let's save it and view it in a browser. And it looks like it works. If I choose a different country, we filter for just that country's worth of data. It's hard to argue that this is a really nice system. We've written no code yet at all, yet we can filter the grid and fill the grid. We can edit data. We can even, for example, move someone from one country. Let's move Elizabeth Lincoln from Canada to France. Click Update. She's gone from here, but she should show up in France now. There she is. Let's edit her, put her back at her home country. Click Update, and she's back in Canada. So it's really easy to get started working with the Gridview control without writing a single line of code. What if, while editing a row, you want to allow a user to select the country from a drop-down list? I had to type France and Canada to move that person from one country to the other. That doesn't make any sense. We know we can get a list of countries. Why don't we just put a drop-down list in the grid? It's easy enough to make this happen. All you have to do is take advantage of the concept of templated columns. In the source for the grid view, ASP.NET adds bound field elements for each column. You saw that already. And ASP.NET renders columns in predefined ways depending on the data type. For example, if you have a primary key and you go into edit mode, ASP.NET turns that into a label. But if you have a read-write field, ASP.NET displays it as a text box. If you have a Boolean field, it might show up as a checkbox. You can convert any bound field into a template field, and then you determine the exact behavior in all of the modes, in edit mode, in normal mode, and all sorts of modes. You can add your own controls, for example, in the header or footer, in alternating rows, and in edit view. There are templates in the design of the grid that allow you to do this. There's an item template, an alternating item template. So you could, for example, just to confuse your users, have item appear one way in the item template and a different way, don't do this, in the alternating item template. You can supply data or controls in the header template and in the footer template. There's also an edit item template for when you're editing. So it's easy to do. All you do is simply convert the column to a template column and then add your own controls. Visual Studio copies the default behavior into this template, so you don't even have to do any work. Nothing changes in the normal behavior. You just can then alter the normal behavior if you need to. Well, let's go add a drop-down list to our edit item template. So when we're editing a user, we can get a drop-down list of countries for that user. In Visual Studio, I'll edit the columns for this grid view control. There's the Edit Columns link there. Okay, so I need to take this country field, which shows up here, and convert it into a template? Well, first of all, you can see this command field here. This command field is, well, it represents the links we see on the left-hand side. Then we have customer ID, company name, contact name, and country. And you can come here and change any feature you want of any of these fields. For example, I may decide for company name, I wanted a space in the name. I figure users can figure out the name as company name, but you're welcome to change it. But at this point, I'd like to turn country into a template field. To do that, I follow this link, convert this field into a template field. I do that, and it magically becomes a template field. And of course, Visual Studio copies over all the existing behavior, but it is now a template field, and you can see that because its icon here is different. Before we leave this dialog box, it's important to note that you can add any number of fields yourself to the Gridview control. You can add a checkbox field, a hyperlink field, and so on. You can add any number of command fields yourself. You can add a template field. You can add any of the bound fields that are available in the data source as well. You can rearrange the fields by moving them up or down. At this point, I need to modify the country field. So I'll click OK. And now, back in the grid, I need to edit templates. Edit templates allows me to edit the templates for this control. Now, which template do we want to edit? Well, at this point, the only column we have that has templates is the country column, so it automatically went there. If we had more than one field, we would have had to select the one we wanted to work with. And for that country field, you can see there are 5 templates we could modify: item, alternating item, edit item, header, and footer for that column. You could, for example, make the header for just this column be a different color if you wanted to. I need to go to the edit item template. Right now, the edit item template for the country field displays a text box. I don't want a text box, so I'm going to delete that control. What I want instead is a drop-down list, so I'll drag that in instead. At this point, I have no reason to enable auto postback. That is, I don't need to force a round trip to the server when I choose a country from this list. I do need to, however, choose the data source. The data source here is SQL Data Source 2, a unique list of countries. That's a perfectly reasonable data source. So I'll choose that. These default values are fine, and click OK. Remember, this indicates the field to display in the drop-down list, and this indicates the field to use as the value of the drop-down list. In this case, they're both country. I'll click OK. I also need to edit the data bindings. Here, I indicate how I want to bind this drop-down list to data. We need to set the selected value property of this drop-down list to be the country field from the data source, so that when you show the drop-down list, it displays the correct country, and when you save the row or update the row, it saves the country back into the country field. Now, it will only save the country back if you have turned on this two-way data binding checkbox. If it's turned on, then ASP.NET generates the code to save the value back to the underlying data set before it's sent back to the data source. If you don't check that, it's just thrown away when you make a change. You can also add custom binding if you want. Rather than using the default binding, you can use the bind method and its various permutations to do whatever binding you want. You might want to look up that bind method to see how you can take advantage of that. But for most examples, just binding to a field will do. You can also choose a formatting. The formatting might go something like this. It uses an expression like string.format would, so you could put in even something like this. Country is, and you can see they give you a sample. This is what would show up in the grid. Well, I have no reason to do that at this point, so I'll just remove it. We have no formatting necessary. I'll click OK. We've now set up this drop-down list. We're pretty much done. We need to, at this point, end template editing. So on the grid itself, I'll right-click, and choose End Template Editing, puts us back in the normal design view. You can't tell that anything's changed here, but when we view the page in the browser and edit a user, we'll see the change. Back in the Gridview's Smart Tag, we need to make sure that these things are still selected, and they are, because we're going to use those features. And let's save everything and browse. Nothing looks different here, but if we go to the Edit mode, you now see in the country a drop-down list of countries. We can choose one. We'll move this person to Brazil. There we are. And when I click Update, person's gone. I look at Brazil. There they are. Let's edit this. Put him back in Argentina. Click Update, and back in Argentina. There we go. So you've seen now how you can modify the grid view control, changing any column into a template field.